If you've been following the recent coverage of Saudi Arabia in the mainstream press, you'll think that they are undergoing some massive humanitarian reforms. So they just allowed women to drive, and The Rock recently praised the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in a bizarre Instagram post. Now, while allowing women to drive and maybe hanging out with The Rock are good things, it's clearly not enough. And Saudi Arabia continues to not be able to take justified criticism without freaking out. And a perfect example of that is what happened this week with Canada. So on August 2nd, Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, tweeted this out. Very alarmed to learn that Samar Badawi, Raif Badawi's sister, has been imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. Canada stands together with the Badawi family in this difficult time, and we continue to strongly call for the release of both Raif and Samar Badawi. And that was followed up the next day with this tweet from the official foreign policy account for Canada. Canada is gravely concerned about additional arrests of civil society and women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia, including Samar Badawi. We urge the Saudi authorities to immediately release them and all other peaceful human rights activists. So, Samar Badawi, as you can see from the tweets there, she is a women's rights activist in Saudi Arabia, which, has to be one of the most bravest things to do in a country like Saudi Arabia, to continue to fight back against this oppressive government while being in that oppressive government, while living in that country, is, I can't even imagine the amount of bravery that takes. And she's dealing with the consequences of that. Now, while Canada's criticism of Saudi Arabia is clearly justified, Saudi Arabia did not like that reaction, that response from Canada. Here's how they responded a couple days later. So on August 5th, the Saudi Foreign Ministry replied with this in a tweet. Statement: the negative and surprising attitude of Canada is an entirely false claim and utterly incorrect. Okay, so if it was just a tweet, whatever. A tweet's a tweet. They're obviously not going to, admit, at least immediately, that what they are doing is wrong. But they followed that tweet up with this. So they kicked out the Canadian ambassador and suspended all business and trade between the two countries. They pulled thousands of students and medical patients from Canada. They ordered the asset managers of their central bank and pension funds to dump Canadian assets, quote, no matter the cost. And they are also suspending Saudi state airline flights to Toronto. All of that because of a justified criticism of Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses. Now, you wonder why other countries walk on eggshells around Saudi Arabia. And that wasn't even the most extreme response, at least in terms of the language. So in terms of the tweet, that initial tweet from the government wasn't the worst thing. The actual an actual terrible tweet came from the Saudi Youth Organization that took it further. So this is an organization that is supported by the Saudi government. And they tweeted out, as the Arabic saying goes, he who interferes with what doesn't concern him finds what doesn't please him. And they added this image of an Air Canada airplane appearing to fly in the direction of Canada's CN Tower that is definitely reminiscent of 9/11, with the quote there saying, sticking one's nose where it doesn't belong. Now, to their credit, they quickly deleted and apologized for that tweet. But how can Saudi Arabia feel free to have this sort of reaction based off warranted criticism? It's because they know they can get away with it. So, our allies, unfortunately, much like Canada in some sense, are in the pockets of the Saudis. So, this from Global News. And among it all, the only response from Canada's two closest allies, the US and UK, have been to call both sides close partners and urge restraint. So, why the silence? Like so many things in politics, it all boils down to the money, said one expert. There's an attempt by the Saudis to create some fear and rattle some of those Western governments into not supporting Canada because they may be cut out or shut out from some potential Saudi economic deals and the big boom that it's undertaking, said Besma Momani, a professor at the University of Waterloo specializing in Saudi relations and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation. Saudi Arabia is the largest weapons purchaser in the world, so any company or country in the world that sells arms, as does Canada, is likely to be looking into how this is going to affect bilateral trade ties. The European Union also refused to get involved. A spokesperson was quoted by the New York Times as saying, quote, "We don't comment on bilateral relations," and that, quote, "we are in favor of a dialogue." So, even though Saudi Arabia should be challenged on these human rights abuses, and of course also on the war in Yemen, none of our allies came to our side. None of them. Except for one person. Can you guess who that is? Of course, Bernie Sanders. He tweeted this out. "This is an outrageous move. It's entirely legitimate for democratic governments to highlight human rights issues with undemocratic governments. We must continue to do so. The U.S. must be clear in condemning repression, especially when done by governments that receive our support." So, while none of our allies came to our side, Bernie Sanders did. This is a politician that actually practices what he preaches. And I mean, it's part of the reason his face is at the end of all of my videos. This is a guy that actually cares, that understands that even if you are an ally with a country like Saudi Arabia, or because of the fact that you are an ally with a country like Saudi Arabia, you need to be willing to call out your friends and tell them when they're doing wrong. Tell them when they're committing human rights abuses. Hold them to a higher standard because they are your allies. Bernie Sanders gets that. Now, Canada, to our credit, are standing by what we said. So here's a quote from Trudeau. "We will continue to stand up for Canadian values and universal values and human rights," Trudeau said at a press conference on Wednesday. "Canada will always speak strongly and clearly in private and in public on questions of human rights," he said. So this is great. And I have criticized Trudeau before, and I'm about to in 5 seconds. But this is, however you want to take this news, what the Canadian government here is doing, what the Liberal government here is doing, is good. Now, just days after this all went down, there was, of course, a Saudi-led strike that killed dozens of children on a school field trip in Yemen. And so far, there has not been an official response from Canada about this. And it may have something to do with the fact that Canada has an ongoing potential arms deal, a $15 billion arms deal with the Saudis. A deal that may be in jeopardy. May be in jeopardy because Saudi Arabia may pull out of it, not because Canada may pull out of it. So, while this is a tough spot, because Canada did the right thing in standing up against these human rights abuses, but they don't go far enough in condemning what the Saudis are doing in Yemen, and still sticking by this $15 billion arms deal. But ultimately, if that deal gets canceled, if the Saudis pull out of it, it would be a good thing. And while the issue with the arms deal is they're going to find someone else to buy weapons from. If it's not Canada, it's going to be somebody else. So that's the unfortunate part about the Saudi position in that. But in terms of Canada, why do we need blood on our hands? We don't. So ultimately, I'm just glad that Canada is standing up, at least in some sense, to the Saudis, and that we actually have, at least one ally in the world in Bernie Sanders.